Chapter 1. Eroticism in Inner Experience. Eroticism, an immediate aspect of inner experience, as contrasted with animal sexuality. Eroticism is one aspect of the inner life of man. We fail to realize this because man is everlastingly in search of an object outside himself, but this object answers the innerness of the desire. The choice of object always depends on the personal taste of the subject. Even if it lights upon a woman whom most men would choose, the decisive factor is often an intangible aspect of this woman, not an object of quality. Possibly nothing about her would force our choice if she did not somehow touch our inner being. Even if our choice agrees with that of most other people, in fact, human choice is still different from that of animals. It appeals to the infinitely complex inner mobility which belongs to man alone. The animal itself does have a subjective life, but this life seems to be conferred upon it like an inert object once and for all. Human eroticism differs from animal sexuality precisely in this, that it calls inner life into play. In human consciousness, eroticism is that within man which calls his being in question. Animal sexuality does make for disequilibrium, and this disequilibrium is a threat to life, but the animal does not know that. Nothing resembling a question takes shape within it. However that may be, eroticism is the sexual activity of man, to the extent that it differs from the sexual activity of animals. Human sexual activity is not necessarily erotic, but erotic it is whenever it is not rudimentary and purely animal. The decisive importance of the transition from animal to man. We know little about the transition from animals to men, but its importance is fundamental. The events taking place during this transition are probably hidden from us forever, yet we are better equipped to consider it than it might seem at first sight. We know that men make tools and use them in order to survive, and then quite quickly, no doubt, for less necessary purposes. In a word, they distinguish themselves from the animals by work. At the same time, they impose restrictions known as taboos. Quite certainly, these taboos were primarily concerned with the dead. Probably at the same time, or nearly so, they were connected with sexual activity. We know the early date of the attitudes towards death through the numerous discoveries of bones gathered together by contemporary men. In any case, Neanderthal man, who was not quite a true man, who had not yet adopted exclusively an upright posture, and whose skull was not so different as ours from that of the anthropoids, did often bury his dead. Sexual taboos certainly do not date from these remote times. We may say that they appeared as humanity appeared, but nothing tangible supports this view insofar as we ought to draw conclusions from prehistoric data. Burying the dead leaves traces, but nothing remains to give us the slightest hint about the sexual restrictions of earliest men. We can only admit that they worked, since we have their tools, and since work, as far as we can tell, logically gave rise to the reaction which determined the attitude towards death, it is legitimate to believe that the taboo regulating and limiting sexuality was also due to it, and the generality in behaviour that is essentially human, work, awareness or death, sexual continence, goes back to the same remote past. Traces of work appear in the lower Paleolithic era, and the earliest burial we know of goes back to the middle Paleolithic. Of course, we're talking about eras which lasted hundreds of thousands of years according to our present calculations. These interminable millennia correspond with man's slow shaking off of his original animal nature. He emerged from it by working, by understanding his own mortality, and by moving imperceptibly from unashamed sexuality to sexuality with shame, which gave birth to eroticism. Man proper, whom we call our fellow, who comes on the scene at the time of the cave paintings, the Upper Paleolithic, is determined by these changes as a whole. They are religious by nature, and he must have felt them as a background to his life. the inner experience of eroticism, the degree of objectivity connected with the discussion of it, the historical perspective in which this must be seen. There is one disadvantage in talking about eroticism in this way. If I call it a direct activity peculiar to man, this is an objective definition. Yet the objective study of eroticism, however interesting I find it, remains for me a secondary consideration. My purpose is to see in eroticism an aspect of man's inner life, of his religious life, if you like. I said that I regarded eroticism as the disequilibrium in which the being consciously calls his own existence in question. In one sense, the being loses himself deliberately, but then the subject is identified with the object losing his identity. If necessary, I can say in eroticism, I am losing myself. Not a privileged situation, no doubt, but the deliberate loss of self in eroticism is manifest. No one can question it. I intend to discuss the theme of eroticism quite deliberately from the subjective point of view, even if I bring in objective considerations in this way. But if I do refer to erotic manifestations in an objective way, I must stress that it is because inner experience is never possible untainted by objective views, but is always bound to some or other indisputably objective consideration. Eroticism is primarily a religious matter, and the present work is nearer to theology than to scientific or religious history. I repeat, if I sometimes speak as a man of science, I only seem to do so. The scientist speaks from the outside, like an anatomist busy on a brain. Well, that's not quite true. Religious history cannot deny the inner experience, past or present, of religion, but that is not important as long as it is forgotten as much as possible. My theme is the subjective experience of religion, as a theologian's is of theology. True, the theologian talks about Christian theology, while religion in the sense I mean it is not just a religion, like Christianity. It is religion in general, and no one religion in particular. My concern is not with any given rites, dogmas, or communities, but only with the problem that every religion sets itself to answer. I take this problem for my own as a theologian does theology. The Christian religion I lay aside. If it were not for the fact that Christianity is a religion after all, I should feel an aversion for Christianity. That this is so is demonstrated by the subject of my present work. That subject is eroticism. I am making my position clear from the outset. It goes without saying that the development of eroticism is in no respect foreign to the domain of religion, but in fact, Christianity sets its face against eroticism and thereby condemns most religions. In one sense, the Christian religion is possibly the least religious of them all. I should like to make my position perfectly clear. In the first place, I want to rid myself of preconceived notions as rigorously as possible. Nothing binds me to a particular tradition. Thus, in occultism or esoteric cults, I cannot fail to see preconceived ideas that interest me because they reflect our religious nostalgia. But I must shun them, just the same because they represent a given belief. I may add that outside the assumptions of Christianity, those of occultism are the most awkward, in that they deliberately deny scientific principles in a world where these are dominant. Thus they turn anyone who accepts them into the sort of person who knows that arithmetic exists, but who refuses to correct his own mistakes in addition. Science does not blind me. If I were dazzled by science, I would conform inadequately to its demands. And arithmetic does not worry me either. Tell me 2 and 2 make 5 if you like, but I am doing accounts with someone with a clear end in view. I shall forget that you claim 2 and 2 equal 5. I do not see how anyone can claim 2 and 2 equal 5. I do not see how anyone can put the problem of religion from the standpoint of gratuitous solutions denied by stringent scientific method. I am not a scientist, in the sense that what I am talking about is indirect experience, not objective material. But as soon as I do talk objectively, I do so with the inevitable rigour of the scientists. I would go so far as to say that, for the most part in the religious attitude, there is such a thirst for slick answers that religion has come to mean mental facility, and that my first words may make the unwary reader think that we have in mind some intellectual adventure, and not the ceaseless search which carries the spirit, beyond philosophy and science if necessary, but by way of them, after every potentiality that can open out before it. Everyone, however, will admit that neither philosophy nor science can answer the questions that religious aspirations have set us. But everyone will also admit that in the conditions that have hitherto obtained, these aspirations have only been able to express themselves in indirect ways. Humanity has never been able to pursue what religion has always pursued, except in a world where the quest has depended on dubious factors, connected, if not with stirrings of material desires, at least with chance passions. It may have struggled against these desires and passions, or it may have served them, but it has not been able to remain indirect to them. It has not been able to remain indifferent to them. The quest begun and pursued by religion, like scientific research, must not be thought of separately from the chance events of history. Not that man has not been wholly dependent on these vicissitudes at some time or other, but that is true for the past. The time is coming, uncertainly enough perhaps, when, with any luck, we shall no longer need to wait for the decision of other people in the guise of dogma before attaining the experience we seek. So far, we can freely communicate the results of this experience. I can concern myself with religion in this sense, not like a schoolteacher giving a historical account of it, mentioning the Brahmin among others, but like the Brahmin himself. Yet I am not a Brahmin, or indeed anything at all. I have to pick my way along a lonely path. No tradition, no ritual to guide me, and nothing to hinder me either. In this book of mine, I am describing an experience without reference to any special body of belief, being concerned essentially to communicate my inner experience, religious experience, as I see it, outside the pale of specific religions. My inquiry then, based essentially on inner experience, springs from a different source from the work of religious historians, ethnographers, and theologists. No doubt, men working in these fields did have to ask whether they could assess the data under their consideration independently of the inner experience, which on the one hand they share with their contemporaries, and on the other resulted to some degree from the personal experiences modified by contact with the world constituting their fields of study. But in the case of such research workers, we can state almost axiomatically that the less their own experience is brought into play, the more authentic are their findings. I do not say the less experience they have, but the less it is brought into play. Indeed, I am convinced of the advantages of deep experience for the historian, but if he does have a profound experience, since he has it, in fact, the best thing is for him to try and forget it and look at the facts objectively. He cannot forget it entirely. He cannot pare down his knowledge exactly to what he knows from the outside, and that is all to the good. But ideally this inner knowledge should influence his thinking in spite of himself, insofar as that source of knowledge is stubbornly there, insofar as talking about religion without reference to our intimate knowledge of religion would lead to a lifeless accumulation of inert facts churned out in no sort of intelligible order. On the other hand, if I look at the facts in the light of my personal experience, I know what I am discarding when I discard scientific objectivity. To begin with, as I have said, I can impose my arbitrary ban on knowledge acquired by impersonal methods. My experience still implies knowledge of the facts I am dealing with, in eroticism of bodies, in religion of the ritual forms without which collective religious practices could not exist. We cannot consider these forms except as illuminated by historical perspective with the erotic value they have acquired. We cannot separate our experience of them from the external aspect and their historical significance. With eroticism, the modifications undergone by our bodies in response to the vigorous stirring within us are themselves linked to the delightful and surprising aspects of sexual creatures. Not only is it impossible to regard this precise data, garnered from many sources, as denying the corresponding inner experience, but it actually assists the experience to stand out from what is individual and fortuitous. Even if it were tied to the objectivity of the outside world, private experience is bound to have an arbitrary flavour, and without its universality would be impossible to discuss. Similarly, without private experience we could discuss neither eroticism nor religion. the conditions of an impersonal inner experience, the contradictory experiences of taboos and transgressions. It is in any case necessary to make a clear distinction between a study which calls on personal experience as little as possible, and one that draws boldly on such experience. We must admit further that if the former had not been attempted in the first place, the latter would remain condemned to a gratuitousness we are familiar with. More, the conditions which make the present viewpoint possible have not long been in existence. Whether we are discussing eroticism or religion in general, a clear inner experience would have been out of the question at a time when the equilibrium between prohibitions and transgressions regulated the play of both did not stand out clearly defined and understood. Knowing that this balance exists is not in itself enough. Knowledge of eroticism or of religion demands an equal and contradictory personal experience of prohibitions and transgressions. This dual experience is rare. Erotic or religious images draw forth behaviour associated with prohibitions in some people, the reverse in others. The first type is traditional. The second is common, at least in the guise of a so-called back-to-nature attitude, the prohibition being seen as unnatural. But a transgression is not the same as a back-to-nature movement. It suspends a taboo without suppressing it. Here lies the mainspring of eroticism and of religion too. I should be anticipating if I were to spend too long now on the profound complicity of law and the violation of law. But if it is true that mistrust, the ceaseless stirrings of doubt, is necessary to anyone trying to describe the experience I am talking about, this mistrust must also meet the demands I will at this stage formulate. Let us say first that our feelings tend to give a personal twist to our opinions. This difficulty is a general one, though it is relatively simple for me to imagine in what way my own inner experience coincides with that of other people, and in what way it enables me to communicate with them. This is not usually admitted, but the vague and general nature of this proposition of mine prevents me from emphasizing it. Leaving that aside, the obstacles opposed to the communication of experience seem to me to be quite another kettle of fish. They are connected with the taboo on which they are based, and this duplicity I mentioned, the reconciling of what seems impossible to reconcile, respect for the law and violation of the law, the taboo and its transgression. One thing or the other. Either the taboo holds good, in which case the experience does not occur, or if it does, only furtively outside the field of awareness, or it does not hold good, and of the two cases this is the more undesirable. Most frequently, as far as science is concerned, the taboo is not justified, it is pathological, neurotic, hence it is seen from outside, even if we have our own personal experience, insofar as we see it as a neurotic phenomenon, we regard it as an outside mechanism intruding on our consciousness. This way of looking at it does not do away with the experience, but it does minimize its significance. Hence, if taboos and transgressions are described at all, they are described objectively by the historian, the psychiatrist, and the psychoanalyst. Eroticism, as seen by the objective intelligence, is something monstrous, just like religion. Eroticism and religion are closed books to us if we do not locate them firmly in the realm of inner experience. We put them on the same level as things known from the outside if we yield, albeit unwittingly, to the taboo. Unless the taboo is observed with fear, it lacks the counterpoise of desire which gives it its deepest significance. The worst of it is that science, whose procedures demand an objective approach to taboos, owes its existence to them, but at the same time disclaims them because taboos are not rational. Insight experience alone can supply the overall view from which they are finally justifiable. If we undertake a scientific study, indeed, we regard objects as exterior to ourselves. We are subjects. In science, the scientist himself becomes an object exterior to the subject, able to think objectively. He could not do this if he had not denied himself as a subject to begin with. Well, this is all very well as long as eroticism is condemned, if we reject it in advance, if we rid ourselves of it in this way. But if, as it often does, science condemns religion, ethical religion, which is patently fundamental to science, we are no longer justified in opposing eroticism. If we do not oppose it, we must no longer consider it objectively as something outside ourselves. We must envisage it as the stirrings of life within ourselves. If the taboo conserves its full force, there is a difficulty. Taboos acted on behalf of science in the first place. They removed the object of the taboo from our consciousness by forbidding it. At the same time, deprived our consciousness, our full consciousness at any rate, of the movement of terror whose consequence was the taboo. But the rejection of the disturbing object and the disturbance itself were necessary for the clarity, the untroubled clarity, of the world of action and of objectivity. Without the existence of prohibitions in the first place, man would not have achieved the lucid and distinct awareness on which science is founded. Prohibitions eliminate violence, and our violent impulses, those which correspond with sexual impulsions can be counted among them, destroy within us that calm ordering of ideas without which human awareness is inconceivable. But if this awareness is to bear precisely on those disturbed impulses of violence, that implies that it has first been able to set itself beyond the reach of taboos. This presupposes that we can direct the light of the questioning intelligence onto these taboos themselves, without whose existence it would never have functioned in the first place. The aware intelligence cannot, in this case, look on them as a mistake we are victims of, but as the outcome of the fundamental emotion on which humanity depends. The truth of taboos is the key of our human attitude. We can know that prohibitions are not imposed from without. This is clear to us in the anguish we feel when we are violating the taboo, especially at that moment when our feelings hang in the balance, when the taboo still holds good, and yet we are yielding to the impulsion it forbids. If we observe the taboo, if we submit to it, we are no longer conscious of it. But in the act of violating it, we feel the anguish of mind without which the taboo could not exist. This is the experience of sin. That experience leads to the completed transgression, the successful transgression which, in maintaining the prohibition, maintains it in order to benefit by it. The inner experience of eroticism demands from the subject a sensitiveness to that anguish at the heart of the taboo, no less great than the desire which leads him to infringe it. This is religious sensibility, and it always links desire closely with terror, intense pleasure and anguish. Anybody who does not feel, or who feels only furtively, the anguish, nausea and horror commonly felt by young girls in the last century is not susceptible to these emotions. But equally there are people whom such emotions limit. These emotions are in no sense neurotic, but they are, in the life of a man, what a chrysalis is compared with the final perfect creature. Man achieves his inner experience at the instant when, bursting out of the chrysalis, he feels that he is tearing himself, not tearing something outside that resists him. He goes beyond the objective awareness bounded by the walls to the chrysalis, and this process too is linked with the turning topsy-turvy of his original mode of being.